Is impossible crime a crime? Before we answer this question, let us first discuss what an impossible crime is. Now, a discussion on impossible crime cannot be had without mentioning the second paragraph of Article 4 in relation to Article 59 of the Revised Penal Code as amended. This is the provision on impossible crime. The second paragraph of Article 4 of the Revised Penal Code states, Article 4, Criminal Liability. Criminal liability shall be incurred by any person performing an act which would be an offense against persons or property, were it not for the inherent impossibility of its accomplishment or on account of the employment of inadequate or ineffectual means. What then is an impossible crime? An impossible crime is one where the act performed would have been a felony against persons or property, but that the same is not accomplished because of the inherent impossibility of its accomplishment or because of the employment of inadequate or ineffectual means. The elements, therefore, of impossible crime are: first element, the act performed would have been a felony against persons or property. Second element, the act was done with evil intent. Third element, the act performed by the offender cannot produce a felony against persons or against property because, number one, the commission of the offense is inherently impossible of accomplishment, or number two, the means employed by the person performing the act is either inadequate or ineffectual. And fourth element, the act performed should not constitute a violation of another provision in the Revised Penal Code or should not constitute another offense punished under Special Penal Laws. We will discuss each of these elements in the succeeding slides. First element, that the act performed would have been a felony against persons or property. Take note of the underscored portion. I am referring to the phrase would have been because it is important in your proper understanding of impossible crime that there should be no actual crime committed. That is why it is worded as would have been, because as you will see later, as I said, and to repeat, no actual crime is committed when we talk about impossible crimes. Here, the offender intends to commit a felony. What kind of felony? The intended felony must be a felony either against persons or against property. The felonies against persons are found in Title 8, Book 2 of the Revised Penal Code. They are parricide, murder, homicide, death caused in a tumultuous affray. We also have physical injuries inflicted in a tumultuous affray, giving assistance to suicide, discharge of firearms, infanticide, abortion, duel, challenging to a duel, mutilation, physical injuries, and rape. On the other hand, the felonies against property are found in Title 10, Book 2 of the Revised Penal Code. They are robbery with violence against or intimidation of persons. We also have robbery in band, attempted or frustrated robbery with homicide, execution of deeds by means of violence or intimidation, robbery by the use of force upon things, possession of pickaxe or similar tools, brigandage, theft, usurpation. We also have altering boundaries or landmarks, culpable insolvency, swindling and other deceits, removal, sale, or pledge of mortgaged property, arson and other crimes involving destruction, and malicious mischief. Take note that the intended felony, I am referring to felony against persons or against property, must not be actually committed. That was what I was saying earlier. Otherwise, the offender will be liable for the felony committed and not for an impossible crime. For example, X stabbed Y, causing the latter's death. There is no impossible crime here because the intended felony, which is either murder or homicide, is actually committed. Also, if the act performed would constitute a crime, be it an offense punished under Special Penal Laws or a felony under the Revised Penal Code, other than the intended felony against persons or against property, then the offender, the so-called offender, will be liable for the crime committed and not for an impossible crime. For example, X, who had no idea that Y is already dead, shot the latter several times with the use of an unlicensed firearm. Here, X will be charged not for the impossible crime of murder, but for the crime of illegal possession of firearms, which is an offense punished under a special law, which is Republic Act 10591. Let's now go to the second element. The second element is that the act must be done with evil intent. That the act was done with evil intent simply means that the offender must have the intention to do an injury to another. Example, X wanted to kill Y. Y, however, was already dead. Just the same, X stabbed Y several times despite the fact that he knows that Y is already dead. Here, there was no evil intent on the part of X because he already knows that he could no longer injure Y. Example number 2. If X did not know at the time he stabbed Y that the latter was already dead, his act of stabbing Y several times would have been considered as an act done with evil intent. There is here an impossible crime of murder or homicide, as the case may be. Third element, that the act performed by the offender cannot produce a felony against persons or against property because the commission of the felony is inherently impossible of accomplishment, or the means employed by the offender is either inadequate or ineffectual. Now, what do we mean by the commission of the felony is inherently impossible of accomplishment? There are actually two kinds of inherent impossibility. We have the so-called legal impossibility. This occurs where the intended acts, even if completed, would not amount to a crime. For example, killing a person who is already dead is a legal impossibility. A person can only die once. Therefore, you cannot kill a person twice. Another example, a thief stealing property which turns out to be the thief's own property. This is a legal impossibility because this cannot fulfill one essential element in the crime of theft, and that is that the property taken or stolen must be owned by another person. The second kind of inherent impossibility is the so-called physical or factual impossibility. This occurs when extraneous circumstances unknown to the actor or beyond his control prevent the consummation of the intended crime. So the difference between legal impossibility and physical or factual impossibility is this. In legal impossibility, the acts are already completed, but still it would not amount to a crime. In physical or factual impossibility, the actor or the person performing the impossible crime was not able to consummate his intended crime. Why? Because of extraneous circumstances unknown to him or beyond his control. Let us go through some examples. First example, X puts his hand in the pocket of Y with the intention of stealing the latter's wallet, but gets nothing since the pocket is empty. This is a factual or physical impossibility because X, intending to steal from Y, was not able to consummate his intended crime of theft, not because of his desistance or unwillingness, but because of circumstances beyond his control. And what is that circumstance beyond his control? The pocket being empty. Or because of circumstances unknown to X. And what is that circumstance unknown to X? He did not know that the pocket of Y was empty, because why would he go to the trouble of stealing or inserting his hand in the pocket of Y when he already knows that the pocket of Y is empty? Another example, X, wanting to kill Y, peppered Y's house with bullets, but it turns out that no one was inside the house. This is a factual impossibility because the absence of Y, meaning Y was not present inside his house, is a circumstance beyond the control of X. Because had he known that Y was no longer inside his house, he would not go to the trouble, just like in example number 1, of shooting at X's house. When the means employed by the offender is either inadequate or ineffectual, what do we mean by that? Here is an example of inadequate means. X, wanting to kill Y, uses a small dose of poison by mixing it with the coffee he gave to Y. X believed that the said dose of poison was enough to kill Y. However, Y did not die and was not physically bothered at all by the said or by the effects of the said poison. This is what? An example of the means employed by the offender is inadequate because it turned out that it was not enough to kill his intended victim. Now, what if the means employed is adequate, but just the same the felony is not produced? For example, X, wanting to kill Y, uses a large dose of poison by mixing it with the coffee he gave to Y. However, Y did not die because he has a strong resistance to poison. Here, X will no longer be liable for an impossible crime. Instead, he will be liable for frustrated murder. What about when we say the means employed by the offender is ineffectual? What do we mean by that? Here is an example of ineffectual means. X wanted to kill Y by putting in his drink a substance which he thought was poison, when in fact it was not. Here, Y will certainly not be killed because the means used by X was ineffectual. It cannot produce, no, for sure, it cannot produce the intended crime because the substance used by X turned out to be not poison, or it turned out to be some other substance which would not or which could not cause the death of Y. Fourth element, that the act performed should not constitute a violation of another provision in the revised penal code or should not constitute another offense punished under special penal laws. Now, the idea of an impossible crime is one of last resort. That is to teach the offender, the so-called offender, a lesson because of his criminal perversity or tendency or propensity. If he can be taught of the same lesson by charging him with some other crime, then he should be charged for that other crime and not for an impossible crime. Now, if the act constitutes a violation of another provision in the revised penal code or constitutes an offense punished under a special law, then the person who performed such act will be punished for that other felony or offense, as the case may be, not for an impossible crime. Take note, there is no impossible crime if the act performed would not have constituted a felony against persons or against property. I already made an enumeration of what are those felonies against persons and felonies against property. In other words, an impossible crime applies only to acts which would have constituted a felony against persons or against property. Question: should the person performing the act know of the impossibility of the crime? Definitely not. If the offender knows that he could no longer cause an injury to another because, for example, the person is already dead, or the poison mixed with the food is inadequate, or because he knows the substance he intends to mix with the food is not poison, or because he knows the vault where the property or the jewelry is placed, for example, is already empty, he would not waste his time doing something in order to gain nothing. And this is true even if the offender just wants to satisfy his grudge in stabbing a dead person whom he had an altercation with when that person was still alive. Going now to the question I first posed at the start of this video, is impossible crime a crime? There are actually two schools of thought on this. The first school of thought, which is the majority view, says it is not a crime because the provision itself, Article 4, Paragraph 2, from which impossible crime is based, merely states by any person performing an act which would be an offense against persons or property, which means that there was no or there is no actual crime committed due to its inherent impossibility or because the means used is inadequate or ineffectual. Also, the provision on impossible crime is not among the specific felonies found in Book 2 of the Revised Penal Code, which defines felonies and prescribes the specific penalties for their commission. The second school of thought, which is the minority view, says it is a crime because while no crime is actually committed, still the so-called offender is being punished for his criminal tendency or propensity. His criminal tendency, as shown by his overt acts, is the crime itself. Objectively, the person performing the act has not committed a felony, yes, but subjectively, he should be considered a criminal. Also, Article 59 of the Revised Penal Code punishes the commission of an impossible crime. And what is that penalty? The penalty is arresto mayor or a fine ranging from 200 to 500 pesos. That being said, I dare say that impossible crime should be regarded as a crime by itself. Why? Because not only the RPC defines what an impossible crime is, it likewise provides for its punishment as shown by or as provided for in Article 59 of the Revised Penal Code.